Bonjour, bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Je suis Boris Proulx, journaliste au journal Le Devoir. Nous avons ce matin la ministre, we have this morning the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, Karina Gould. I'm Boris Proulx, reporter for Le Devoir, and I'll be moderating this press conference. We'll have a few remarks by the minister, followed by a question period in the room and then on Zoom. Alors, si vous écoutez la conférence de presse sur Zoom, je vous invite à utiliser la fonction « Lever la main » à tout moment. Et nous allons venir à vous après les questions dans la salle. So on that, the floor is yours, Minister.
Great, merci beaucoup. Good morning, everyone. La terre sur laquelle nous nous réunissons est le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. I want to just begin by saying that today is a truly historic day. Notre gouvernement travaille fort pour que toutes les familles aient accès à des services d'apprentissage et de garde de jeunes enfants de qualité, abordables et inclusifs, peu importe où elles vivent au pays. Nous avons fait des progrès incroyables pour créer et maintenir le nouveau système pan-canadien d'apprentissage et de garde des jeunes enfants. Les familles ayant des enfants dans des services d'apprentissage et de garde réglementés ont déjà vu leurs frais réduits dans chaque province et territoire du Canada. Au Nunavut, au Yukon et au Québec, les familles bénéficient des frais de garde moyens de 10 $ par jour ou moins. Le Yukon et le Québec ont atteint cet objectif avant même que notre système pan-canadien ne soit mis en place. Le Nunavut, lui, a atteint cet objectif ce mois-ci. C'est la première juridiction au pays à atteindre 10 $ par jour depuis la signature de nos accords. We have heard from parents across the country who have seen their fees reduced by hundreds of dollars each month. A mom in British Columbia who is paying only $455 a month for 2 kids, saving up to $1,000 because of the recently announced fee reductions. Parents who are able to accept a full-time position after years of staying part-time because of daycare costs. We are delivering on our commitment. And we want to ensure that these achievements are lasting ones. That is why we are acting to protect this crucial support for families and children, so that future generations of families across Canada can continue to count on the remarkable progress we've achieved so far. This morning in the House of Commons, I introduced Bill C-35, the proposed Canada Early Learning and Childcare Act. The act that would enshrine into federal law the principles of our Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. It would make clear in the legislation the federal government's long-term commitment to families in Canada. And it makes it harder for any future government to cancel or cut childcare and undo all that we have achieved for children and families, together with the governments of jurisdictions across the country. And we know there is cause for concern. We have seen it from previous Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole, who said he would scrap our childcare plan and instead introduce a tax credit. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre gloated that his party in government has, in his words, canceled childcare systems that past Liberal governments had promised to deliver. And in the last election, every Conservative member of Parliament ran on a promise to get rid of affordable childcare for Canadians. So we know the threat of this transformational childcare initiative from federal Conservatives is very real. And the government and Parliament must protect what we have built. The bill would enshrine in the legal framework of Canada access to affordable, inclusive, and high-quality early learning and childcare as an obligation to which the federal government must commit itself. It will also ensure federal funding for the Canada-wide system remains in place beyond our current agreements with provinces, territories, and Indigenous peoples. Simply put, this bill will ensure the system we build remains in place long into the future. La journée d'hier a marqué un anniversaire important. Le 7 décembre 1970, la Commission royale d'enquête sur la situation de la femme au Canada a publié son rapport historique. L'une des principales conclusions de la Commission était que les services de garde d'enfants sont essentiels pour que les femmes aient des occasions d'emploi égales et la possibilité d'optimiser leur potentiel dans leur vie professionnelle. C'était évident à ce moment et ça l'est aujourd'hui. Des services d'apprentissage et de garde des jeunes enfants inclusifs et abordables constituent un moteur puissant à la fois pour l'économie et l'égalité sociale. Les défenseurs des droits des femmes se battent depuis des décennies pour obtenir des services de garde d'enfants abordables. Les choses ont évolué pour le mieux depuis, mais même un demi-siècle après la publication du rapport de la Commission royale, ces avantages demeurent hors de portée pour de nombreuses femmes et familles au Canada. That is why this historic legislation is so important, so that generations of women can enjoy the benefits that Florence Bird and the Royal Commission could only dream of, and that children in Canada can get the best possible start in life. Pour les provinces, les territoires et les peuples autochtones, cela représente un financement à long terme et une collaboration continue avec le gouvernement du Canada. Il enchasserait aussi dans la loi le Conseil consultatif national sur l'apprentissage et la garde des jeunes enfants. Le Conseil réunit des aidants, des praticiens, des chercheurs et des défenseurs de divers horizons, donnant au gouvernement fédéral des avis sur des enjeux et des défis auxquels est confronté le secteur d'apprentissage et de la garde des jeunes enfants. Ce projet de loi est un grand pas en avant. Je tiens vraiment à vous remercier à tous ceux qui ont participé au processus d'engagement. The feedback from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis governments and organizations, as well as provincial and territorial governments, experts and advocates, and was wide-ranging and has helped shape the bill we have introduced today. And I hope soon to be able to celebrate the establishment of the Canada Early Learning and Childcare Act. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Merci, thank you. We will now go to questions. On va maintenant procéder aux questions, d'abord dans la salle et ensuite sur Zoom. So first up, I have Mac Gray from Global.
Hi, Mister. There are not any guidelines for the provinces in terms of standards they need to live up to. There's no long-term funding goals associated with this. Can you outline essentially what you're trying to do here? Are you essentially trying to Pierre Poilievre-proof any future childcare plans?
Well, so first of all, this legislation is complementary to the multilateral agreements that we have signed with all 13 provinces and territories. And quite frankly, we learned from 2006 when Stephen Harper, one of the first things that he did upon forming government as the Conservative Prime Minister was to rip up the childcare agreements that the previous Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin has signed with all 13 provinces and territories. We want to protect what we have built. We already have 13 provinces and territories that have signed on to these agreements that are delivering results for Canadians across this country. And we want to ensure that that continues into the future and that we make it that much harder for any future government to, basically take apart what we have built, but also to put families at a disadvantage because families are making decisions based on these reduced childcare fees.
But to that, what about this bill will actually make it harder for future governments to rip it up? There's no real teeth to it from reading the legislation in terms of holding provinces to account or holding the federal government to future standards associated with the childcare plan.
Well, I would push back on that because it's complementary to the agreements that we have signed. And those agreements are binding contracts over 5 years. But one of the things that we know is important is that long-term funding. So even though it's booked into the fiscal framework following those 5-year agreements, this legislation does commit the federal government to being there to support provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples financially when it comes to childcare. And it's embedded in legislation the principles of affordability, accessibility, inclusion, quality that the agreements are based on. So it absolutely is an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to childcare, to making sure that not only do we have the financial resources, the $30 billion that was committed in 2022, We now have 13 agreements signed with premiers across this country, and now we have federal legislation that is saying the federal government is there for the long term.
Laura Thompson from CP.
I want to ask you again about this issue of being able to future-proof the daycare system. The Conservatives have made no secret about wanting to repeal this legislation, take a different tack to childcare. So how difficult would it be for them to repeal this legislation or to seriously amend it?
Yeah. Well, look, legislation is evergreen, but they would have to do that. They'd have to demonstrate to Canadians why. They'd have to debate it in the House of Commons. You know, what we saw in 2006, because there was no legislation, that the Conservatives could change the agreements and change their position without having to actually go back to Parliament, without actually having to go to Canadians and say, we're making these changes. So you're right, in a sense, you know, legislation is never future-proof, but what I think is the fact that Conservatives wouldn't be able to hide this. They would have to very publicly tell Canadians that they do not believe in affordable childcare. They will not be supporting families, and they will not be building a system. And one thing that's really important and that's really different is that tax credits do not build a system. They don't address space creation. They don't address quality. They don't address inclusion, and they certainly don't address any of the infrastructure or workforce needs that we see across this country. They also don't address making sure that everyone has access to the system. Because in order to have a tax credit, it means you have to have the level of income to receive that tax credit. This system is about trying to reach all Canadians where they are and to kind of demonstrate that as a government, as a society, we believe in supporting our children, and that no matter where they live in this country, no matter what their family income is, we're going to be there to help get them off on the best start possible.
The other potential threat to the future of this program is, of course, the cooperation of the provinces and territories. The political landscape there is changing significantly. The next time you go to renegotiate this deal, you could be negotiating with Danielle Smith. And so do you see that this legislation may in the future contain some of those details, some of those sort of conditions of those agreements embedded in the federal legislation rather than having to renegotiate it every 5 years and risk the program falling apart?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And one thing that I would say, because it is unique in what we've done with childcare, and I think it's been particularly successful, is because we have principles that we have applied across the country. We also have national objectives that each province and territory is meeting based on their own unique situation. So each province and territory is doing things a little bit differently, but within the framework that we have proposed nationally. And the other thing is, because of this, the provinces and territories also have ownership for delivering this program. And we've signed these agreements, and what we're seeing now is in almost every jurisdiction, provinces and territories have met their objective to reduce fees by 50%. We're seeing some tremendous work in parts of the country in terms of workforce, in terms of space creation, in terms of inclusion. And so I think what's important about childcare and how we've done things differently is that there's a real ownership and accountability on behalf of provinces and territories, because they also have a commitment and an obligation to deliver these results for the citizens of their jurisdiction. And what I have felt, even with provinces and territories who maybe were late to sign on to the agreement, is that there's really good collaboration and there's a really good partnership between both levels of government to achieve this. And maybe I'll just add one more thing, because part of the reason we did this is because we knew that it was also an economic driver. And we knew that there was going to be a significant return on investment, not just for our economy as a whole, but also for families, for women entering the workforce. And we saw on Monday that women's workforce participation in Canada is at an all-time high, partly because women have confidence that they can afford childcare. So there is tremendous benefits in this, and I firmly believe that as we continue to move along this path and as we continue to expand and develop and deliver on this pan-Canadian childcare vision, that we're going to continue to see that ownership, that buy-in, and that accountability to deliver for Canadians, irrespective of which jurisdiction they live in.
Kevin Gallagher, CTV.
Morning, Minister. There we go. There's a promise from your government for $10 a day on average, but there's nothing in here that would enshrine your definition of affordability. So how is that determined within this legislation? How will parents be assured that what is affordable here is actually affordable to them?
Oh, it's a great question, Kevin. And as I said, this legislation is complementary and builds off of the agreements that we have signed. It's very important that those two items go together because we did sign these bilateral agreements with provinces and territories, and in there we do outline what those objectives are. So 50% fee reductions on average by the end of this calendar year, and getting to $10 a day on average by 2025, 2026. We want to make sure that we can continue to work with provinces and territories within those principles, and to also see how the system evolves. This is something completely new that we're doing in Canada, and we have to make sure that we are working in partnership and collaboration with provinces and territories, understanding what the challenges are and making sure that we can iterate as we move forward. But what is important is that that principle of affordability is in there, and we are going to continue to make sure that that happens as we move forward.
So after 2026, there'll be renegotiations with the provinces, at which point in time they may say, sorry, we can't do $10 a day anymore. It's got to be $15 a day.
Well, we'll have that conversation, but the objective is they have to meet at 25, 26, $10 a day. That's what they have all agreed to. And so if they're unable to do that, they have to explain to their citizens why they haven't been able to meet those objectives. Because the way it worked is we said, here are the 4 principles, here are the objectives we expect you to meet. And then the provinces and territories came up with their own plans on how they were going to meet those objectives. So there's considerable ownership on the part of the provinces and territories to meet the objectives that they set out for themselves and that they promise to the citizens within their jurisdiction.
Tom Perry, CBC.
Hi, Minister. Thanks for taking our questions. Is there any way within this legislation that a future government could, say, roll back funding or say we were going to offer tax credits as another means and stay within the spirit of the law? Or does this really kind of cement in your vision of childcare?
This cements our vision of childcare, and I would say Canadians' vision of childcare. This is about making sure that we are building a system. And so, you know, a future government could make other decisions, but not that would compromise the spirit of this legislation.
Any kind of target for when you're going to get this through, when this is going to get passed?
Oh, as soon as possible, I hope. But of course, you know, that depends on the will of Parliament. But I'll do everything that I can to do this as soon as possible.
Merci, thank you. We'll now go on Zoom. If you are attending on Zoom and you have a question, please use the raise hand function at this moment. First up is Maura Forrest, Politico.
Yes, thank you, Minister. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
My first question follows up on my colleague, Kevin Gallagher, I think. This question of $10 a day, I mean, do you see it as being sort of $10 a day kind of in perpetuity? Would it be indexed to inflation down the road? Would provinces potentially all end up with slightly different rates? Like, how do you see that unfolding past 2026?
Well, I guess my first response is we have to get to 2026 first, and we need to see how things go over the course. But the objective is to really keep it there. I mean, when we look at Quebec, who has been a pioneer in this space, you know, they started at $7 a day 25 years ago, and 25 years later, they're at $8 a day. So I think the principle of affordability and making sure that there is that that benchmark that means that no matter what your income level is, you can participate. Of course, the reason why we say average is because there's always going to be some people who maybe pay $0 or $2 a day, depending on their income. And it was really important for us that as we were negotiating these agreements, that we ensured that for folks who are already paying less than $10 a day, that they can continue to have access to extremely affordable, or in some cases free, childcare, because that's what they need, and that's what the province is already providing.
Okay, thank you. And on the question of the deadline for this year, the 50% reduction, how confident are you that all provinces and territories are going to meet that deadline? And are there any consequences if they don't?
So I'm very confident that we're going to see pretty much all provinces and territories meet that deadline. There may be one exception, however, that province has committed that they will meet that 50% fee reduction very early in the new year. So I'm feeling pretty good about this. We have a couple more provinces who need to confirm that they're going to do that, but all signs indicate that we're on the right track.
Merci, thank you. I see no other questions on Zoom. Je vais y aller pour une question en français, and then we'll go for another round if Minister has time. Je me demandais pour le projet de loi C-35, on dit que ça va rendre compte des investissements fédéraux. Je me demandais comment ça s'applique au Québec, alors que dans l'entente, il ne devait pas y avoir de conditions.
Oui, mais ça garantit au Québec, au gouvernement du Québec, que le gouvernement du Canada sera là à long terme pour avoir des transferts en matière de garderie. On sait que Québec était déjà un pionnier dans cet espace, mais encore, c'est justement pour assurer au gouvernement, mais plutôt aux Québécois, aux familles québécoises, que le gouvernement du Canada est là pour soutenir ce système.
Follow-up, le NPD dit que c'est grâce à lui que vous avez déposé maintenant un projet de loi. Est-ce que le NPD, conformément à votre entente, a été consulté? Est-ce qu'il y a eu un rôle à jouer dans votre dépôt de projet de loi C-35?
Bon, ce que je dirais, c'est que on a commis de faire ça en le budget 2021. C'était bien en avance d'entente avec l'NPD. Ça, c'est dans ma lettre de mandat. Ça faisait toujours partie du plan du gouvernement du Canada, du Parti libéral, d'assurer que nous faisions ce projet de loi. Mais bien sûr, je suis contente d'avoir l'appui du NPD. Nous sommes dans une situation minoritaire et nous avons besoin d'un partenaire à cet égard.
Kevin, I see you have another question.
Sure.
I understand that you want this bill to prevent future federal governments from undoing the work that you've done. But I think one of the criticisms is there doesn't seem to be any teeth in the language here that prevents provinces from leaving. Mm-hmm. So other than, if you can tell me what every 13 province and territory has in terms of penalties if they leave, is it just they're walking away from federal money? You know, if they can't, what prevents provinces from reneging on their deals?
Yeah, so I mean, we do have 13 agreements with provinces and territories that are legally binding contracts, and they have annual targets and objectives that they have committed to meeting, and regular reporting with the federal government, as well as biannual implementation committee meetings where we discuss the progress and the challenges that they're having. Of course, you know, if they decided to walk away, they would be leaving a lot of federal money on the table, but more importantly, they'd be leaving a lot of families in the lurch. They would need to explain to the families in their jurisdiction why they will no longer be supporting them. I have to say, I don't believe that's a situation that would occur. I have tremendous working relationships with all 13 provinces and territories. And, as I said, even some of the provinces that were late to sign on, are really, I think, taking this seriously and really want to deliver this because they've actually realized how important this is in the affordability context in which we're living, but also in an economic context. They're seeing the return on investment that we are making. And, I think that what Canadians are realizing as well, many of whom knew this already, that this is not just an important social policy, it's an extremely important economic policy as well.
But that you're saying they face a political and maybe a financial penalty if they leave. But, is there nothing in here that could have strengthened the bond that provinces would have to adhere to these federal standards beyond that? Because if it's just about, if a provincial government's willing to take the hit financially, and they think that this is not going to work in their budget, or they can't make the program work for whatever reason, there's nothing else here that really holds them to these standards beyond those agreements,
Well,
right?
this is federal law, so it applies to the federal government.
Jurisdiction? Is there
But
an
that's
issue
what-
there?
But this is a federal law that applies to the federal government. We have the bilateral agreements that hold the provinces and territories to account.
But is there a jurisdictional issue here with putting that type of language in this bill that would prevent the federal government from doing that, since it is provincial jurisdiction?
Well, we're talking about a federal law, and as you know, in Confederation, provinces and territories in the federal government are equal in that. So our laws apply to the federal government, and what's, I think, exciting and historic about today is the fact that we are legally obliging the federal government to be there in partnership, in collaboration with the provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples on childcare, and saying to Canadians across this country that we're there for them.
I see that Maura online has another question, perhaps the last one.
Yes, thank you. Minister, can you just confirm which province it is that you were mentioning that might not be quite on track for the 50% reduction at the end of this year, and why that is?
Yeah, so it's Manitoba. Manitoba did a 30% fee reduction last spring, and they are already one of the provinces that has the lowest childcare fees in the country. They're at about $20 a day, and they're on track to meet that 50% reduction early in 2023.
Thank you very much. That's all.
Merci beaucoup. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Thanks to all.
OK, merci tout le monde. Bonne journée. Thank you.